The moment Maude Townsend rose from her chair in the corner of Harlan's general store, the entire room fell silent as though God himself had pressed a hand against the noise. She had been sitting there for the better part of 2 hours, hunched over a thick ledger that nobody had bothered to notice, a cup of cold coffee at her elbow, her dark hair pinned beneath a plain bonnet that did absolutely nothing to draw attention. The men crowded around the central table had spoken over her, around her, and through her as though she were a piece of furniture. They had argued and postured and slapped their palms on the wooden surface. They had made declarations about land and rights and the future of Caldwell Creek, Colorado, in the year of our Lord 1883, and not a single one of them had so much as glanced toward the quiet woman in the corner. Until she stood. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the kind of voice that carried the particular authority of absolute certainty, the way a rifle shot carries further than a shout because the sound has somewhere specific to go. "Elias Drum," she said, "has been filing false survey claims on land he does not legally own, using a deed that was forged in the spring of 1881, witnessed by 2 men he paid in whiskey and silver, and recorded in Mesa County under the name of a man who died of cholera before the ink was dry." The room did not just go quiet. It stopped. Every breath, every shift of boot leather on the plank floor, every scrape of a chair leg against wood, all of it suspended, like a clock suddenly unwound. Elias Drum himself sat at the head of the table. He was a large man with the kind of prosperous stomach that came from years of eating other men's labor. His face, which had been flushed with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won, went the color of old ash. And beside him, on his left, sat Clayton Crawford. Clayton had ridden into Caldwell Creek 3 days ago with the kind of lean, sunburned silence that told you he had seen the worst the frontier had to offer and had not yet decided what to make of it. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way of a man who had worked cattle since before his voice had finished changing, with dark eyes beneath a battered hat brim that had been shading them from the Colorado sun for the better part of a decade. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from sandstone and a stillness about him that some men mistook for slowness. Those men generally ended up regretting the mistake. He had been brought to this meeting by Drum as a hired surveyor, a man with a good reputation for reading land and keeping his mouth shut. He had been in this room for an hour and had said approximately 4 words. He had also, in that hour, been quietly developing the unsettling suspicion that the numbers Drum kept referencing did not match the land he himself had walked 3 days prior. Now he turned in his chair and looked at the woman standing in the corner for the first time, truly looked, the way you look at something that has suddenly and irrevocably changed the nature of the room it inhabits. Maude Townsend's eyes were a shade of gray-green that reminded him of the Kansas sky in late October, right before a storm decided to become serious. She was holding the ledger open with one hand, her finger marking a specific line on a specific page, and her expression was one of absolute composed certainty. She was not frightened. That was the thing that hit Clayton Crawford in the chest like a physical blow. In a room full of armed men, with Elias Drum staring at her with the undisguised fury of a man who had just watched his entire careful architecture begin to crumble, this woman was not afraid. She was ready. 2 weeks earlier, Maude Townsend had arrived in Caldwell Creek on the stage from Denver with a surveyor's kit, a lawyer's education she had received through sheer stubborn self-teaching from every legal text she had been able to borrow or purchase in the preceding 7 years, and a purpose so specific it had kept her moving through the kind of grinding, solitary work that would have broken most men twice her size. She was 27 years old. She had grown up on a homestead 40 miles southwest of Caldwell Creek, the daughter of a man named Robert Townsend, who had broken his back literally and figuratively to build a cattle operation on 260 acres of Colorado grassland. Her mother had died when Maude was 11. Her father had died when she was 22, leaving her the land and a cloud of debt she had spent 3 years clearing, one careful dollar at a time. She had also left her with an extraordinary inheritance that had nothing to do with money. Her father, Robert Townsend, had been a gifted surveyor in his own right, a man who had learned the Gunter's chain and the compass traverse from a government surveyor passing through when Robert was 16, and who had spent the next 4 decades measuring, recording, and understanding land the way a doctor understands the human body. He had taught Maude everything he knew. By the time she was 14, she could read a township plat with the fluency of a musician reading sheet music. By the time she was 18, she could detect a fraudulent survey by the inconsistency of its bearing angles before she had even consulted the original field notes. Her father had always said that the land did not lie. Men lied. Numbers lied when men made them. But the land itself, the shape of a ridgeline, the course of a creek, the angle at which the sun struck a particular rock face at a particular time of year, the land kept its own honest record if you knew how to read it. Maude knew how to read it. The Townsend land had been her world, her grief, and her occupation for 5 years after her father's death, until the summer of 1882, when a man named Elias Drum had ridden onto her property with a piece of paper that claimed he owned it. The paper had looked legitimate at first glance. It had the right stamps. It had witnesses. It had a recording number from the Mesa County Land Office, and it claimed that 160 acres of the western portion of Robert Townsend's original homestead had been legally purchased from a man named Thomas Carey in the spring of 1881. Maude had stood at her front gate, read every word of that document twice, and then looked up at Elias Drum with an expression of such controlled, arctic fury that even he had shifted slightly in his saddle. Thomas Carey, she had said very quietly, died in March of 1881. I attended his burial. I have a letter from his wife, dated 6 weeks after his death, in which she describes selling his horse and his tools to meet the cost of moving back to Ohio, where she could not mention any land transaction because there was none. This deed is a forgery. Drum had smiled the smile of a man who had prepared for exactly this response. He had also brought 3 men with him, which had been his way of explaining, without saying it outright, that what he had in law he could also settle by other means. Maude had not moved from her gate. She had also not given up the deed. She had instead spent the following year building a case so meticulous, so thoroughly documented, and so unassailable in its logic that the only thing she had lacked was a venue in which to present it where the outcome was not predetermined. The Mesa County Land Office had been useless. She had later discovered that 2 of its clerks were in Drum's financial pocket. The territorial court had a 6-month backlog and a judge who was, at the very kindest interpretation, indifferent to homestead disputes that did not involve large ranching interests. So she had done what her father had always said a smart person did when the direct road was blocked. She had found another road. She had spent 2 months in the Denver Public Library, methodically working through every land claim Elias Drum had filed in the past decade. She had cross-referenced them against county death records, original homestead filings under the Homestead Act of 1862, and the field notes of the original government surveyors who had platted this section of Colorado territory. She had corresponded with the General Land Office in Washington. She had written 17 letters. 12 had been ignored. 4 had received polite acknowledgments. 1 had received a response that had made her sit very still for a long moment before she began to understand exactly how large this problem was. Elias Drum had not forged 1 deed. He had forged 9. Across 3 counties, he had built a land empire of approximately 4,000 acres using a combination of dead men's names, bribed witnesses, falsified government surveys, and a county recording system that was either too understaffed or too corrupt to catch what he was doing. The response from the General Land Office had contained, buried in its careful bureaucratic language, a reference to a federal investigation that had stalled for lack of a credible local witness willing to present evidence in a public forum. Maude had understood immediately. The investigation existed. The evidence existed. What did not exist was someone local who could stand in front of Drum's people, in Drum's territory, and name him aloud in a setting where his denial would have to contend with documented facts rather than threats. She had packed her surveying kit, her ledger, her letters, and 3 years of meticulous notes, and she had come to Caldwell Creek. She had arrived knowing that walking into Harlan's general store during the weekly land meeting, a meeting that had been ostensibly called to discuss the orderly development of new grazing range north of town, which was itself almost entirely composed of fraudulently claimed land, was the equivalent of walking into a hornet's nest with a torch. She had sat in the corner for 2 hours and let them talk, and she had listened to every word, and she had confirmed 3 separate things she had suspected but not been entirely certain of. And then Drum had made the particular mistake of standing up and announcing, with the comfortable authority of a man who believes he is absolutely safe, that all the land north of Caldwell Creek had been legally surveyed and properly recorded, and that any person who suggested otherwise was simply poorly informed. That was when Maude Townsend had stood up. Now she stood with the room frozen around her, and Elias Drum staring at her with the particular expression of a powerful man who has just realized that the quiet person in the corner was not quiet because she was harmless, but because she was finished preparing. "I have," Maude said, her voice still calm, carrying the ledger open toward the light from the store's front window, "the original field notes from the government survey of sections 14, 15, and 22 of Township 7, filed by surveyor J.B. Aldrich in 1876. I have Drum's filed deed for those sections, which references a survey conducted in 1881 by a man named Percy Wells. I have also conducted my own survey of those sections in the past 12 days. Mr. Wells' survey contains 17 bearing errors that would be impossible to produce by honest measurement. Specifically, the magnetic declination values he used were calibrated for eastern Kansas, not western Colorado. Every single line is off by 4 degrees in 22 minutes. At the scale of a township section, that difference is not a paperwork error. It is deliberate fraud." The room exhaled. One of the ranchers at the table, an older man named George Pitts who had been in the territory since '68 and who had no particular relationship with Drum beyond proximity, turned and looked at the large man at the head of the table. He said nothing. He simply looked. Drum's face had completed its journey from ash to something darker, a kind of compressed, contained violence that the people in this room had seen before, usually right before something went badly wrong for someone. It was Clayton Crawford who moved first. He did not stand up loudly or make a dramatic gesture. He simply shifted his chair back from the table by 6 inches, enough to give himself room to stand cleanly if he needed to, and he turned and looked at Drum with those dark, still eyes, and he said very quietly, "I'd like to hear more about those bearing errors." Drum looked at him. "Crawford, I walked sections 15 and 22 myself 3 days ago," Clayton said, "at your request as part of this very meeting. The ridge line I measured on the eastern boundary of 15 does not match your filed deed by the distance I recorded. I put it down to instrument variation, but 4 degrees and 22 minutes. He paused. "That is not instrument variation." The room shifted again, because now it was not just a woman with a ledger. Now it was a hired surveyor with field notes of his own, and the arithmetic between the two was beginning to assemble itself into something that could not be dismissed. Maude looked at Clayton Crawford for the first time, truly looked, and what she saw surprised her. She had expected resistance. She had prepared for resistance. She had not entirely prepared for a man with a surveyor's compass, who had quietly been arriving at her same conclusion from the opposite direction, and who was now, in front of an extremely dangerous man, stating it aloud. She had also not entirely prepared for the way he looked at her when she held his gaze. Not with the particular wariness men usually directed at a woman who had just demonstrated she knew more than them. Not with condescension, and not with the flustered, recalibrating quality of a man whose assumptions had been disrupted in a way he resented. He looked at her the way a person looks at something genuinely remarkable, the way you look at a piece of landscape that suddenly reveals itself to be far more complex and beautiful than the initial view suggested. She filed that observation away and returned her attention to Drum. "I have written documentation of 9 separate fraudulent land claims," she said. "I have copies with 2 attorneys in Denver, 1 in Pueblo, and 1 letter already filed with the General Land Office in Washington. I am not presenting this information to threaten you, Mr. Drum. I am presenting it because these people," she gestured briefly at the ranchers and townspeople in the room, "deserve to know that the land they have been buying, leasing, and in some cases losing their life savings to purchase borders land that is built on fraud, and that the man telling them what is and is not legal in this valley has been systematically stealing from them, and from the homesteaders whose claims he has subsumed." George Pitts made a sound in the back of his throat that was somewhere between a cough and a verdict. Drum stood up. He was a large man, and he had the physical authority of someone who had spent years using it as a first argument. "This woman," he said, his voice dropping to the register that preceded bad decisions, "is a hysterical spinster who has had a personal grievance against me since I legally purchased land that her dead father—" "My father's deed," Maude said, and her voice cut clean through his without raising itself, "is on file with the original Homestead Act application number 17-412, filed in 1867, predating your fraudulent survey by 9 years. The land you are currently occupying on the western boundary of the Townsend property was never yours to purchase. It was never Thomas Carey's to sell. Thomas Carey had no legal interest in that land. His name appears on your deed because he was dead and could not deny it." There was a very long moment of silence. Then 3 things happened at once. Drum's hand moved toward his coat. Clayton Crawford was out of his chair. And Maude Townsend, who had anticipated this particular possibility with the same methodical thoroughness she had brought to every other element of this confrontation, stepped sideways behind the substantial wooden counter of Harlan's General Store, which she had identified 2 hours ago as the best cover in the room. She was not a helpless woman, but she was also not a fool. Clayton moved with the fluid, unhurried speed of someone who has diffused bad situations before and knows that the first critical second belongs to whoever acts without hesitation. He put himself between Drum and the counter, not in a way that was dramatic, simply in the way of a large man who is choosing to occupy a particular piece of space, and he said with absolute calm, "I think we are done with the physical portion of this conversation." Drum looked at him. Something in Crawford's face, the stillness of it, the particular quality of a man who has nothing to prove and therefore cannot be impressed by threats, made the large hand stop its movement. "You work for me," Drum said. "I worked for you," Clayton said, past tense. "My fee was for 3 days of surveying. I have completed 3 days of surveying. What I found is my own business." There was another long moment. Then Drum, with the calculated restraint of a man who is retreating in order to regroup rather than surrendering, straightened his coat, looked around the room at faces that were watching him with new and uncomfortable expressions, and walked out. His 2 associates followed. The door closed. The room exhaled again, more completely this time. Clayton turned and looked at the woman behind the counter, and he said, because it was simply true, and he was not a man who left true things unsaid when they were relevant, "That was the most thorough land fraud case I have ever seen presented in a general store." Maude came around the counter. She was not flushed. She was not shaking. She looked, if anything, like a woman who had just completed a task she had been working toward for a very long time and was already thinking about the next one. "It needed to be thorough," she said. He has resources. Incomplete evidence would have given him room to maneuver. Those bearing calculations, Clayton said. You mentioned 4 degrees in 22 minutes. Yes. I need to see your field notes. She studied him for a moment. He had a direct quality about him, something straightforward and unhurried, the manner of a man who asks for what he needs and does not dress it up in either false modesty or false authority. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind this quality. "All right," she said. They went to the small table in the corner where she had been sitting for the past 2 hours, and she opened the ledger and laid it flat. And for the next 45 minutes, Clayton Crawford read her survey notes with the focused, concentrated attention of a professional examining work that genuinely interested him. He asked 3 questions. All 3 were excellent questions, the kind that demonstrated not just technical knowledge, but an understanding of the specific logical structure of what she had built. She answered all 3 fully, and on the 3rd answer she drew a diagram in the margin of her notebook with a stub of pencil, and he leaned over her shoulder to read it, and she was aware of his closeness in a way she had not been aware of anyone's closeness for a long time. When he straightened, he looked at her with an expression she could not entirely categorize. Admiration was part of it, respect, and something else, something more personal that he appeared to be in the early stages of deciding what to do with. "You did this alone," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. 2 years of survey work, legal research, and correspondence. Almost 3. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Caldwell Creek continued its ordinary afternoon, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred inside Harlan's general store. "My name is Clayton Crawford," he said, as though realizing he had not yet said it. "I'm a freelance surveyor out of Denver. I have worked the Front Range and the Eastern Slope for the past 9 years. Maude Townsend," she said. "My family had land 40 miles southwest of here before Elias Drum decided it was his." "Had," he said. "He moved men onto the western parcel 18 months ago. I have been building the legal case to remove them." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "And today?" "Today was the beginning of the public record," she said. "Drum will try to quiet this. He will attempt to discredit me and to use whatever legal and extralegal pressure he has available to make the evidence disappear. But the copies are already filed and distributed, and now there are witnesses in that room who heard specific allegations with specific documentation, and that changes his options considerably." "He may also try to make you disappear," Clayton said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter and more careful. "I am aware of that possibility," Maude said, and met his eyes without flinching. He held her gaze for a moment that stretched slightly longer than a purely professional exchange would require. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "The Caldwell Creek boarding house. That is not a safe location. Mrs. Harlan runs it, and Mrs. Harlan's brother has worked for Drum for 4 years. Maude absorbed this. It was the kind of detail that her research had not surfaced, and she filed it with the particular discipline of someone who knows that gaps in information are dangerous. "You have been in town 3 days, she said. "I pay attention to who is connected to who," he said simply. "It is a professional habit." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Outside, one of the ranchers who had been at the meeting, the older man George Pitts, caught her eye through the store window and gave her a nod that she interpreted as a kind of endorsement. "I have a tent," she said. "I have been sleeping at my survey site on the North Ridge. It is not comfortable, but it is mine." "I have a camp as well," Clayton said. "East of the creek, 1/4 mile from the road." He paused. "There is no particular reason," he added with the careful precision of a man choosing his words exactly, "why 2 surveyors working adjacent areas of the same fraudulently claimed land could not make their camps within reasonable proximity of each other for safety purposes." Maude looked at him. There was something almost painful about his carefulness, the evident intention to give her every possible exit from the suggestion before she decided whether to accept it. "That is a reasonable professional arrangement," she said, and watched something ease slightly in the line of his jaw. They packed up their respective materials and walked out of Harlan's general store into the Colorado afternoon, which was bright and sharp and smelled of pine resin and the distant possibility of rain. George Pitts was waiting on the porch. He was a weathered man in his late 50s with the slow, deliberate manner of someone who had seen enough bad endings to know the difference between recklessness and courage. "Miss Townsend," he said, "I want you to know that my eastern pasture line has been bothering me for 2 years. Drum's men keep pushing the fence further north every time I ride out there. I never had proof of what they were doing." He paused. "I believe I may now understand why." "Your eastern pasture," Maude said. "What are the section numbers?" he told her. She opened her ledger and made a note. "I will look at the original survey lines for those sections. If they have been moved, there will be a record of where they were supposed to be." George Pitts looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been quietly losing a fight he could not articulate and has just been offered the vocabulary for it. "I am grateful," he said with great simplicity. They parted ways from him on the porch, and Maude and Clayton walked together down the main street of Caldwell Creek, which was a modest settlement of perhaps 300 souls, a railroad spur still under construction 2 miles north, a courthouse that served 3 counties, and the usual assortment of commerce and conflict that collected wherever people were trying to make something permanent in a landscape that was still deciding whether to allow it. Clayton walked on the outside of the boardwalk without having to think about it, which was a reflexive courtesy that Maude noticed without commenting on. They collected their horses from the hitching rail outside the store, hers a solid gray mare, his a black that was slightly too good for a man who claimed to be an ordinary hired surveyor, she noted, and rode out of town toward the creek and the northern ridge. They did not talk much on the ride. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of 2 people who were each thinking about several different things at once, and were mature enough to allow that without demanding the other person perform sociability. She showed him her camp on the ridge first. It was neat and methodical, as she was, with the survey equipment organized by use, the reference materials in a waterproof box, the field notes in a separate case. He studied the layout for a moment, and she watched him take in what the organization of it said about her, the same way she had taken in the quality of his horse. Then she rode down to his camp by the creek, which was similarly spare and functional. He had a good setup for extended field work, the kind of camp that could be broken and moved in under 20 minutes, which told her he had been doing this long enough to value mobility over comfort. They stood by the creek in the early evening light, which was turning the water the color of copper, and Clayton said, "Tell me about the Thomas Carey deed. How did you find the original survey that predated it?" She sat on a flat rock near the water and told him. Not the abbreviated version, not the careful professional summary, but the whole story, because he had asked, and because he was listening with the full, unguarded attention of someone who was genuinely interested rather than waiting for the pause in which to speak. She told him about her father, about learning to survey at 14, about the years of building the homestead after his death, about Drum's men arriving at her gate. She told him about the Denver library and the 17 letters and the one that had mentioned the federal investigation. She told him about the 12 days of survey work in the field north of Caldwell Creek, working alone with the compass and the chain and the transit, mapping fraudulent boundaries in the pre-dawn cold and the afternoon heat. Clayton listened to all of it. When she was finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the creek. "My father lost land to a fraudulent title claim," he said, "in Kansas in 1868. He could never prove it. He knew, but he could not prove it, and it ate at him for the rest of his life." He paused. "He died still knowing and still unable to do anything about it." Maude looked at him. In the copper evening light, his face had a quality of old and specific grief that she recognized because she had seen it in mirrors. "I am sorry," she said. "It is why I became a surveyor," he said, because the only people who could have helped him were people who understood the land well enough to show that the numbers were wrong, and there was no one like that where he was. He looked at her. Until today, I had never actually seen it done. Something quiet and significant passed between them in that moment, the kind of recognition that happens when two people discover they have been living parallel versions of the same wound and have each, independently, decided to do something about it. "The federal investigation," Clayton said. "The one the General Land Office mentioned. Do you know who is leading it?" "A man named Marshal Theodore Goss out of Denver. I have been in correspondence with him for 6 months. He believes there is a case, but says he needs a credible public presentation of evidence that generates local witnesses, because the federal process requires a minimum of 3 independent corroborating sources before he can compel a formal hearing." "Today gave you witnesses," Clayton said. "Today gave me George Pitts and perhaps 4 others who will, in the clear light of tomorrow's morning, have to decide how frightened they are of Elia's drum versus how angry they are about what he has been doing to their land." She paused. "And it gave me you, if you are willing." He looked at her steadily. "I was walking those sections 3 days ago and finding discrepancies that I could not explain. I have field notes, independent field notes produced before this meeting, before I had spoken with you, before I knew you existed." He paused. "That is exactly what a federal investigation calls an independent corroborating source." Maude felt something loosen in her chest that she had been holding tightly for 2 years. She had built this case alone. She had planned this confrontation alone. She had told herself that was sufficient and had believed it because she had needed to believe it. The sensation of someone choosing to stand alongside her, not because he was paid to, not because she had asked him to, but because the evidence and his own conscience had already brought him to the same place, was unexpectedly affecting. "It is," she said, and her voice was very steady, which was its own kind of discipline. That night, camping in adjacent sites on the east side of Caldwell Creek, they ate separate meals from separate supplies but sat across a shared fire that was, in practical terms, exactly halfway between the two camps. Clayton made coffee. Maude contributed the better coffee beans, because she had learned a long time ago that good coffee was a non-negotiable comfort in field conditions. They talked for 3 hours about surveying, about the Homestead Act and its implementation and its failures, about the specific mathematics of the Gunter's chain, and why it remained the standard despite better instruments being available, about the particular injustice of the land fraud system that preyed on homesteaders who could not afford lawyers and did not know enough about survey notation to spot the errors in fraudulent deeds. At one point, testing a theory she had been developing about the magnetic declination errors, Maude picked up a stick and drew in the dirt the precise geometric proof of why Percy Wells' bearing values were impossible for western Colorado. She drew it quickly, from memory, narrating as she went in the focused, economical way of someone who has explained technical concepts often enough to know exactly which words are load-bearing. Clayton sat very still while she drew, and when she finished and looked up at him, the expression on his face was one she had not been expecting. He was looking at the diagram, then at her, with an expression of such complete, unguarded astonishment and admiration that it stopped her mid-sentence. "What?" she said. "I have been doing this for 9 years," he said very slowly. "I have worked with government surveyors, military engineers, railroad survey crews. The magnetic declination error as a detection method, that is not something I have ever seen used as a forensic tool. That is," he stopped, shook his head slightly. "That is brilliant." Maude looked at him for a moment. She had been told her work was useful, even impressive. She had not been looked at quite like that before, with that specific quality of a competent man encountering something that has genuinely exceeded his expectation and not minding at all. "It was my father's insight," she said. "He noticed it on a disputed boundary claim 20 years ago and mentioned it once, almost in passing. I have been developing the methodology since." "You should write it down," he said. "Formally, it should be in the literature." "I have begun," she said. He nodded, the way a person nods when they have just confirmed a theory they were hoping was true. They were quiet for a while after that. The fire settled. Somewhere down the creek, an owl conducted its negotiations with the dark. "How long have you been working this territory?" Maude asked. 9 years, he said. "I came out from Missouri after my father died. Started as a ranch hand, learned the survey work from a man named Elkins who worked for the Colorado Territorial Survey Office. He was an old-school chainman, knew every inch of the Front Range by feel. Taught me that the land tells its own story if you give it the courtesy of listening." My father said almost exactly that. "Maybe all the good surveyors say it," he said, and the edge of a smile crossed the corner of his mouth for the first time since she had met him. It changed his face substantially. She noted this and then firmly did not continue noting it. "What will Drum do?" she asked, returning to the practical. "Tonight, nothing. He needs to assess how much damage was done and who in that room is likely to be a problem. He has lawyers on retainer in Denver who are better than most. He will also reach out to whatever influence he has in the county court." Clayton's voice had taken on a certain focused, serious quality. "He cannot afford to let the federal investigation gain momentum. If Marshal Goss is genuinely building a case, Drum needs to discredit you before the corroborating evidence reaches Goss in a formal package. Then we need to get the formal package to Goss before Drum can move on the local evidence. How quickly can you compile everything?" "I have most of it compiled already. I need your field notes, properly signed and dated, and I need written statements from anyone in that room who is willing to put their name to what they heard." "George Pitts will," Clayton said. "I saw his face when you named the sections. He has been waiting for someone to give him this." "I will visit him tomorrow morning," Maude said. "I will come with you," Clayton said. Then carefully, "if you want." She looked at him across the fire. The offer was real and uncomplicated, a practical alignment of purpose, but also, she understood, something slightly more than that, an indication of direction. "I want," she said simply, and watched him accept this with the same care he had given his own offer. 3 days followed that were among the most intensely productive of Maude's already productive life. She and Clayton worked through the morning hours at the survey sites, completing the last sections of her map, and adding his independent measurements to the cross-reference file. In the afternoons, they rode to the properties of the men who had been in Harlan's general store, drinking bad coffee on front porches and parlor chairs, while she laid out the documentation, and Clayton sat quietly at her side, answering the technical questions that came from men who needed to understand the numbers before they would commit their names to a formal statement. 5 men gave statements. George Pitts gave 2, one about his own boundaries and one about what he had witnessed at the meeting. A homesteader named Bart Alcott, who had been watching Drum's men encroach on his north pasture for 3 years and had been too isolated and too worn down to fight it alone, sat down at his kitchen table and read every line of Maude's documentation with shaking hands, and then looked up with an expression that was some terrible combination of grief and fury and relief. "He took 80 acres from me," Alcott said. 80 acres I broke with my own hands." "We will get them back," Maude said, with the kind of certainty that was not a comfort offered to make him feel better but a technical assessment of the odds. Alcott looked at Clayton. "Is she right?" "She is right," Clayton said. On the second night, Clayton cooked. He was not a talented cook. His contribution was a Dutch oven stew of canned beef and dried vegetables that was honest rather than inspired. But he made it with the focused competence he appeared to bring to everything, and they ate by the creek in the late summer dark and talked about things that had nothing to do with land claims or bearing angles. He told her about Missouri, about the farm where he grew up, about learning to read by the light of a lantern when the family could not afford to waste tallow before dark, about the particular quality of the Missouri River in spring when the snowmelt came down from the mountains and the current changed its character completely, about his horse, the Black, whose name was Morrow after a cavalry officer he had once met briefly and had never forgotten. She told him about her mother, who had been a schoolteacher from Ohio and who had brought 3 wooden crates of books to a Colorado homestead and considered this the most important furniture in the house. About learning to ride before she could reliably read, because the land required horses before it required libraries. About the specific loneliness of the years after her father died, not the ordinary loneliness of distance, but the particular kind that comes from having no one to talk to who understood the same things you understood. I have not told many people about those years, she said, and then was slightly surprised at herself for having said it. I have not asked many people about theirs, he said. They sat with this for a while, the creek running its quiet conversation beside them, the Colorado dark enormous and indifferent overhead. The case, she said after a while, is almost ready. If we can get the compiled package to Marshal Goss in Denver by the end of the week, and if Goss acts quickly, the formal hearing could be ordered within a month. The copies you filed in Denver, he said, with the attorneys, are they secure? Both attorneys were recommended by the General Land Office contact. I believe they are trustworthy, though I understand that nothing is entirely certain. Write Goss tomorrow, Clayton said. Tell him you have independent corroborating survey notes and 5 local witness statements. Tell him the confrontation has already occurred and that drum will be moving to suppress evidence. Tell him he needs to act before the end of the month if the window of local cooperation is going to hold. I had already planned to write that, she said. I know, he said. I wanted to say it anyway, and there was something in the way he said it, not checking her work, simply standing alongside it, that she understood correctly. The letter went to Denver the next morning on the westbound stage. Clayton's field notes, formally signed, dated, and witnessed by the stage driver as an official legal document per the territorial notary provisions, went with it. On the 3rd morning after the confrontation at Harlan's General Store, Maude rode out to the westernmost edge of her family's original homestead and stood at the fence line that Drum's men had moved north by 60 yards over the past 18 months. She stood there for a long time, looking at the land that had been her father's and hers, the particular grass of it, the way the ridgeline rose to the west, the place where the creek bent and the cottonwood trees grew. She had not let herself feel the full weight of what had been taken from her while she was building the case. She had kept it technical, methodical, a problem to be solved. She had not let herself grieve it because grief took energy she needed for documentation. She felt it now, quietly and privately in the morning sun of a Colorado August. She heard Clayton's horse before she heard him. He pulled up beside her and looked at the fence line and then at the land on the other side of it and then at her face. He did not say anything. He simply stayed. After a while she said, "He moved the fence while I was in Denver. I came back and it was 60 yards inside my line. His men were on my land. I had to stay on this side while she stopped. I want it back," she said, and her voice was very even and very clear and very fierce. "You will have it," he said. She turned and looked at him. In the clear morning light, she could see the lines of his face precisely, the way the sun had weathered it, the steadiness of his eyes. He was looking at her with an expression that was no longer simply professional respect or the careful courtesy of a man trying not to presume too much. He was looking at her the way you look at someone who has become essential. She was not sure exactly when her own feeling had aligned with his. Perhaps it had been the first night, when he had asked to see her field notes and then read them with the attention of someone who understood exactly what they represented. Perhaps it had been George Pitt's front porch, when Clayton had sat beside her without making it about himself, present and useful and entirely without the need to be the most important person in the room. Perhaps it had been the fire and the diagram in the dirt and the expression on his face. She was a practical woman. She had spent a long time not allowing herself the luxury of things that required vulnerability. But she was also her mother's daughter, and her mother had brought 3 crates of books to a Colorado homestead because she believed that beauty and knowledge and love were not luxuries. They were requirements. "Clayton," she said. "Yes." I appreciate that you have been careful not to presume anything." He waited, very still, in the way of a man who has learned that the right response to a sentence that has a sequel is silence. "I am telling you," she said, "that you don't need to be quite that careful." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile and not quite relief, and was actually more powerful than either. "All right," he said quietly. He did not do anything dramatic. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, which was the most natural gesture in the world, and they sat there at the fraudulent fence line on the edge of her father's land in the Colorado morning, and held on to each other for a while. It was the kind of beginning that suited them both, unhurried, clear-eyed, built on something real. Marshal Theodore Goss arrived in Caldwell Creek on the 14th day after the confrontation at Harlan's General Store. He came with 2 federal deputies, a court order from the territorial judge in Denver, and the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for the exact combination of evidence and public testimony that had just landed in his office. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his 50s with the specific manner of a long-experienced lawman, someone who had processed enough human dishonesty to be neither surprised by it nor indifferent to it. He read Maude's compiled documentation for 3 hours in the courthouse conference room, pausing occasionally to ask a question that was always precisely on point, and at the end of those 3 hours he looked up and said, "Miss Townsend, I want you to know that this is the most thoroughly documented case of systematic land fraud I have seen in 22 years of federal investigation." "Thank you," she said. "I also want to tell you that the 2 copies you filed with the Denver attorneys were both reviewed by people in Drum's employ before they reached the attorneys. The attorneys flagged it and contacted my office. We intercepted an attempt to purchase and destroy one of the copies. The other copy is secure." He paused. "You were right to file multiple copies." She had known this was a possibility. She had built for it. Knowing it had actually happened was, nonetheless, a cold thing to learn. Clayton, sitting across the table from her, reached under the table and found her hand. She held it and did not show anything on her face. Goss issued the formal order for Elias Drum's arrest that afternoon. Drum was found at his ranch property 12 miles north of Caldwell Creek. He did not resist. He was a man who had built his power on paper and process, and he appeared to understand, in the moment when federal deputies arrived with a federal order, that the paper and process had turned against him. He was transported to Denver 3 days later. The trial, when it came 6 weeks later in the territorial court, lasted 4 days. Maude testified for 6 hours across 2 sessions. She was the most precise and technically detailed witness the court reporter had ever attempted to transcribe, and the stenographer requested a 15-minute break partway through the first session in order to change his paper supply, having used more of it than he had anticipated. Clayton testified for 2 hours with his independent field notes, and the combination of his testimony and Maude's created a case that Drum's Denver lawyers, who were very expensive and very able, could not dismantle because the mathematics could not be argued with, and the dead men could not be resurrected to sign different names. George Pitts testified. Bart Alcott testified. 3 other men testified. 2 of the original fraudulent witnesses, who had been found in New Mexico and Kansas respectively, agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges. Elias Drum was convicted on 7 counts of land fraud, 2 counts of fraudulent survey filing, and 1 count of conspiracy to destroy federal evidence. He was sentenced to 14 years in the Colorado Territorial Prison in Cannon City. On the day the verdict came in, Maude was sitting in the courthouse gallery when the foreman read it, and she did not make a sound or change expression until they were outside in the Denver street in the October cold, where she turned and put her face against Clayton Crawford's chest and breathed. He put his arms around her and held her. "It is over," he said quietly. "Almost," she said, because she was who she was. "We still need the formal land restoration orders." He laughed, a full, genuine, warm laugh that she felt against her, and she laughed too, and it was the best sound either of them had made in a long time. The formal land restoration process took another 3 months. It was conducted through the General Land Office and the Mesa County Land Records Office, which had been placed under federal supervision as part of the investigation's conclusions. Every fraudulent deed was voided. Every surveyed boundary was restored to the original government plat. Every homesteader who had lost land to Drum's scheme was formally notified of their restoration rights. Bart Alcott got his 80 acres back. George Pitts got his fence line straightened by 62 yards in his favor. 7 other homesteaders across 3 counties received land restoration orders for a combined total of approximately 4,300 acres. Maude Townsend got her 160 acres on the western boundary of the Townsend homestead back. The day the restoration order was formally issued was in December of 1883. The land north of Caldwell Creek was under 8 inches of snow. Maude rode out to the western fence line anyway, because some things needed to be done in the actual physical fact of them rather than in paperwork. Clayton rode with her. She dismounted at the old fence line, the real one, the one her father had built, which she could identify by the particular composition of the posts, different wood than the ones Drum's men had used, and stood in the snow and looked at her land. "Hello," she said to it quietly, which was the kind of thing a person says to land when there is no one around to hear them being sentimental, except that Clayton was there and heard it and said nothing, which was exactly right. She turned and found him watching her with that expression she had by now catalogued quite fully, the one that meant she was the most important thing in his field of vision. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me?" "I have been a man who keeps moving, 9 years of moving, different territory, different clients, different camps." He paused, looking at the snow-covered land. "I have not particularly wanted to stop moving, until now." Maude looked at him. The Colorado winter had made his face sharp and serious, but his eyes were very warm. She had been thinking about the question he hadn't quite asked yet for the better part of 2 months, and she had reached some conclusions. "This land," she said, "needs work. The house needs repair. Drum's men were not careful with it. The eastern pasture fence is in poor condition. The well needs to be redug because they contaminated it." She paused. "It will be a full year of work minimum before it is functioning the way my father built it." "That is a lot of work for one person," Clayton said. "It is," she agreed. He looked at her steadily. "Maude." "Yes." "Will you marry me?" It was not quite a question in its intonation, which she suspected was accurate to his character, a man who had been certain about this for some time and was not uncertain now, only careful to give her the full and unconditional choice. She had been certain for some time as well. "I will," she said. "Yes." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and kissed her in the Colorado snow with the full, unhurried certainty of a man who has spent a long time moving toward the right place and has finally arrived. They were married in the first week of February, 1884, in the Caldwell Creek Methodist Church, which was a small building that was nevertheless full to the last pew, because the events of the previous autumn had given the valley a new understanding of who Maude Townsend was and what she had done for them, and people showed up, in the plain, honest fashion of frontier communities, to mark that. George Pitts stood up for Clayton. A woman named Clara Abbott, who ran the Caldwell Creek schoolhouse and who had become Maude's first close friend since the Homestead years, stood with Maude. The minister, a young man from Ohio named Reverend Hooks, who had been in the territory less than a year and had not yet lost his capacity for being moved by things, performed the ceremony with a genuine sincerity that the assembled Caldwell Creek population found refreshing. When he pronounced them married and Clayton turned and looked at Maude with that expression she now knew completely, she felt something settle in her so deeply and so permanently that she understood, with her characteristic precision, that this was the exact counterweight to every year of solitary work and grief and sustained, grinding purpose. It was not the resolution of those things. It was the completion of them. She kissed him in the church to a general sound of approval from the people of Caldwell Creek. which was perhaps not strictly traditional, but was entirely appropriate to the circumstances. The winter of 1883 into '84 was hard, as Colorado winters were, but the Townsend homestead. They had some affectionate, ongoing discussion about whether to call it the Townsend place or the Crawford place, and had currently arrived at the Townsend Crawford homestead, which satisfied both of them, sustained it well. Clayton was an extraordinary horseman and a competent carpenter, and the work of restoring the house and outbuildings had a particular satisfaction to it that came from doing it together. He was also, she discovered, a man who could read in the evenings by lamplight without fidgeting, which she had not known she required in a husband until she experienced it. Her mother's 3 crates of books had multiplied over the years to fill 2 shelves in the main room, and Clayton worked his way through them with the focused interest of someone who had always been hungry for reading and had rarely had the leisure for it. He and Maude developed a habit of reading different books and then discussing them over dinner in a way that Maude found, to her own slightly startled realization, to be the most purely pleasurable part of her day. He was also, she found, a man of considerable patience and a very good listener, which she had known in the professional context but discovered applied equally to the personal one. On the evenings when the accumulated weight of the previous years pressed in on her, the grief of her parents, the years alone, the sustained fight, the specific cost of all that sustained effort, he listened without trying to solve it or redirect her, and then held her with the same quality of complete, unhurried presence that had characterized everything he did. She was not easy, she knew. She was exacting and independent and had strong views about surveying methodology and a tendency to think in technical detail at moments when other people were thinking in approximations. He did not find these things difficult. He found them, apparently and genuinely, the most interesting qualities in the room. "You know," he said once in March over the dinner table, "that when I first walked into Harlan's general store in October, I noticed you immediately." She looked at him, mildly surprised. "You did not appear to notice anyone. That is different from not noticing. I noticed you and thought, here is a woman who is waiting for something. And the something she is waiting for is extremely important. And then I thought, I hope no one in this room is foolish enough to get in her way." He paused, with the edge of that smile she had catalogued. "I was, of course, subsequently proved correct." "You were on the wrong side of the table," she said. "I was," he said without apology, "for approximately 47 minutes, and then I recalibrated." She laughed, and he looked at her with open delight at the sound of it, which was one of his most disarming qualities. The unguarded way his face showed his love for her, as though it had not occurred to him to moderate it. In the spring of 1884, the formal paper that Maude had been developing since her Denver research period, the technical methodology for using magnetic declination variance as a forensic tool in disputed land survey cases, was completed and submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers Quarterly Journal, which had been newly established in the preceding decade. Clayton had read every draft of it and made exactly the kind of comments that were useful, technically precise, never personal, always aimed at making the argument stronger. The paper was accepted for publication in the summer issue of 1884. It was the first technical survey methodology paper in the journal's history to have a female author. Maude received a letter from the editor that said, among other things, that 3 different government surveyors had read the advance copy and written to the journal requesting permission to adopt the methodology in their active field work. She read this letter twice, and then sat very still for a moment in the way she did when something significant had happened. Clayton came in from the yard to find her sitting at the table with the letter in her hands. "What is it?" She handed it to him. He read it and looked up. His face was doing the thing where it showed everything. "Your father would have been very proud," he said. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "Yes," she said, "he would have." He sat down beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they sat together in the good quiet of the homestead in the Colorado spring, with the creek running audibly through the open window and the smell of new grass coming in from the land that was hers again. That same spring, Maude discovered she was expecting their first child. She received this information from the doctor in Caldwell Creek, a competent man named Dr. Adler, who had been practicing on the frontier for a decade and had the characteristic frontier medical directness, and walked home from his office through the April town with a feeling she could not entirely categorize, which was unusual for her. She was not afraid, exactly. She had helped birth calves and foals on her father's homestead from the time she was 12. She understood the biological reality. But this was different, because it was hers, because it was theirs, and because the particular future it implied was one she had not allowed herself to plan for in the long years of solitary work and legal battle. She arrived at the homestead to find Clayton at the corral, working with a young horse he had been training through the winter. He saw her face and came over immediately. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," she said. He waited. "I am going to have a baby," she said, and saying it aloud made it real in a new way, and she felt her throat tighten with something that was not sadness but was its close cousin in the neighborhood of overwhelming. Clayton stood very still for a moment, looking at her face, and then he said her name in a way that contained everything, and took her in his arms right there at the corral in the April sun, and held her close and long. "A baby," he said quietly against her hair. "In October, Dr. Adler believes." He pulled back and looked at her face with an expression of such unguarded, luminous happiness that it steadied her in exactly the way she needed to be steadied. "I want to do a good job of this," she said. "I want to do it well." "You will," he said, with the absolute certainty of a man who has watched her be thorough at everything she has ever attempted. "You cannot know that," she said, with the reflexive precision of a woman who distrusts unsupported certainty. "I know you," he said simply. She accepted this, because it was not a reassurance, it was an assessment. The summer of 1884 was productive in every sense. The restored homestead came fully into operation with the spring planting. Clayton had expanded the cattle operation by 20 head, using the contacts he had built in his years of traveling the territory, and the eastern pasture that had been neglected during the long years of the legal fight was fenced and regrassed and beginning to look, under the Colorado summer sky, like the land her father had described in his old field journals. George Pitts, who had become a regular presence at the homestead in the way of a neighbor who has decided you are his business, pronounced the cattle operation satisfactory, which from George was the equivalent of effusive praise. Clara Abbott came out from town on Saturdays to visit Maude, and the two women sat on the porch in the summer evenings and talked about everything from territorial politics to Latin grammar to the ongoing project of civilizing the West, which was proceeding with the usual mixture of genuine aspiration and profound human failure that characterized most large projects. Bart Alcott and his wife Nora drove out from their restored property in June and spent an afternoon. Nora Alcott, who had the particular quality of a woman who had survived hard years with her essential character not just intact but refined, looked at Maude and Clayton together over the dinner table with the expression of someone confirming a thing they had hoped was true. "You look settled," she said to Maude. "Not the kind of settled that means you have given up. The other kind." "The other kind," Maude agreed. In August, a letter arrived from the General Land Office in Washington that contained two things: a formal commendation for Maude's contribution to the federal investigation that had resulted in the Drum conviction, and an inquiry about whether she would be willing to serve as a consultant on two additional disputed land cases in western Colorado that had similar characteristics of fraudulent survey claims. She read the letter and looked at Clayton across the breakfast table. "It is paid work," she said. "Federal rate for expert consultation. Will you take it?" he asked. "My condition will become visible within 2 months," she said, with the practical directness that was one of her most characteristic qualities. Federal consulting in 1884 is an unusual enough proposition for a woman that I suspect several people involved will have strong feelings about a visibly pregnant female expert consultant. They can have strong feelings, Clayton said, and then look at your survey documentation, and then revise their feelings. She considered this. Yes, she said, that is approximately what will happen. She wrote back accepting the consultation. The work proved to be, as she had predicted, attended by some institutional resistance and some recalibrated strong feelings, and an enormous amount of legitimate technical difficulty that she navigated with her characteristic combination of meticulous documentation and unruffled precision. Clayton accompanied her on the field surveys when the terrain permitted it, and handled the physical aspects of the chain work that became more cumbersome as her pregnancy advanced. He did this without being asked and without making it a negotiation, which was one of the things she loved about him. She loved many things about him. She had been keeping, not quite consciously, a kind of running inventory, the way she kept field notes, the precise record of specific observations, the way he said her name, the way he made coffee in the mornings with the same care he applied to everything, not as a performance of domesticity, but as a simple expression of attention. The way he looked at the land when they were in the field, with the focused love of a man who has spent his life learning how to read it. The way he listened when she was working through a technical problem, present and available but not interrupting, understanding that the presence itself was sometimes what was needed rather than the addition of more information. The way he loved her, which was steady and warm and undemonstrative in public and entirely demonstrated in private, and which had the quality of something that was not going to change because it was not performing anything. She was, she understood, very happy. Specifically and factually happy, in the way that she assessed most things not as an aspiration or an absence of difficulty, but as an active, measurable condition of her life. She had her land back. She had her work. She had published research. She had a husband who was her equal and her partner and her counterweight, and she had the October baby coming, and she had Caldwell Creek and the mountains and the creek running outside her window and her mother's books on the shelf. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the full account balanced. Samuel Robert Crawford came into the world on October the 9th, 1884, at 4 a.m, in the main room of the Townsend Crawford homestead, attended by Dr. Adler and Clara Abbott and Clayton, who had been present for the entirety of it with the particular kind of courage that is different from but not lesser than any other kind. He was named Samuel for Clayton's father and Robert for Maude's, which was the kind of logical solution to a naming question that would have satisfied both of their predecessors enormously. He was, from the first day, a loud and opinionated and thoroughly healthy baby, which Dr. Adler pronounced excellent, and which Maude privately found to be a satisfactory set of initial characteristics for a person who would be spending his life on a working homestead. Clayton held him on that first morning, in the gray October light coming through the window, with the expression of a man who has not previously understood a particular thing about himself, and has just, without warning, understood it completely. He looked at the baby and then at Maude, and his face was entirely open in a way that she had seen before, but not quite this version of this particular quality of a man who has arrived, finally and irreversibly, at the place he was meant to be. "Hello," he said to Samuel, with the same quiet sincerity that Maude had used to greet her restored land, and she found, to her own surprise, that she had to blink hard once and then was perfectly composed again. The first years of Samuel's life coincided with a period of significant professional development for both his parents. The methodology paper Maude had published generated correspondence from surveying professionals and legal scholars across the territory and beyond, and she found herself in the unexpected position of being a recognized authority in a specific technical field that intersected with land law in ways that the General Land Office, the federal courts, and the Colorado Territorial Administration were increasingly willing to acknowledge. She took 3 more consultation cases over the following 2 years. She won them all. In 2 cases, the fraud was confirmed and reversed. In one case, the original deed proved to be genuine, and she said so, which generated its own reputation, the recognition that her conclusions could go either way and were therefore worth having. Clayton built his own small survey practice from the Townsend Crawford homestead, working primarily in the spring and fall when the field conditions were best, and managing the cattle operation through the summer and winter. They were not wealthy, but they were not struggling, which was a frontier success that most of their neighbors regarded with quiet respect. George Pitts was at the homestead often enough that Samuel, learning to speak, attempted to say his name somewhere around month 18 and produced something that sounded like Mr. Pitts, which George found funnier than anything that had happened to him in years, and which caused him to become, in the permanent record of the Townsend Crawford household, Mr. Pitts for the rest of his natural life. Clara Abbott arrived every Saturday morning unless the weather made it impossible, and sometimes when it made it inadvisable. She brought books and news from town and the specific quality of a woman friend's company that Maude had not realized she had been missing until she had it, and which she now understood to be a genuine and irreplaceable category of human good. In the spring of 1886, Maude discovered she was expecting again. She told Clayton at the breakfast table, with the same directness she had applied to everything, and he responded with the same quality of total present happiness he had shown the first time, which she had wondered if it would repeat and was glad to discover it did. "Another October?" he asked. "Dr. Adler says November." "A November baby," he said, and smiled, and reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat there in the morning of a May in Colorado with their first son pulling himself along the bench beside his father's leg and the homestead doing its spring business outside the windows. Their daughter, Eleanor Jane Crawford, arrived on the 12th of November, 1886, in the same room and attended by the same doctor and the same Clara Abbott, and was the most immediately serene baby either of them had encountered, which Dr. Adler said sometimes happened with second children who grew up listening to a busy household from inside. Eleanor from the earliest days had her father's eyes and her mother's particular quality of focused attention, watching everything around her with a careful, interested calm that made everyone who interacted with her feel that she was taking very thorough notes. Samuel, 2 years old and highly proprietary about the world in general, inspected his sister with the expression of someone who has received a gift they are not quite sure what to do with, and then sat down next to her and patted her head once, which was apparently his initial assessment of the situation, and was thereafter his consistent position. He was her most devoted defender by the time she was 3 months old. The years that followed had the particular quality of a life that has been, after long effort, correctly assembled. The homestead grew and improved. The cattle operation expanded to a size that required 2 additional hands in the summer season, which brought a young man named Pete Hollies and his older brother Dan from a failed mining claim to the north, who were hardworking and steady, and became a permanent feature of the Townsend Crawford operation. Maude continued her consultation work, which had by 1888 become formalized enough that the Colorado Territorial Administration had created a specific informal role for her as a land fraud review consultant unofficial, because the official structures did not yet have a category for what she did, but practically operative in the way that many frontier institutions ran on the practical rather than the formally acknowledged. She was 32. Her hair had one gray strand at the temple, which she had noticed and decided was a reasonable representation of the facts. She was at the height of her professional capability, running an operation she had built from the remnants of her father's estate, publishing in national journals, raising 2 children who were loud and curious and healthy, and married to a man who was, every day of their life together, the person she had not known she was working toward. One evening in the autumn of 1888, 5 years after the confrontation in Harlan's general store, Maude and Clayton sat on the porch of the Townsend Crawford homestead in the Colorado dusk with the children inside, and the cattle settling for the night, and the mountains going dark blue against the orange of the sky. She had been reviewing the final proofs of her second published paper, a follow-up methodology for using original government field notes as authoritative reference in disputed deed cases. He had been reading one of her mother's books, a collected volume of Tennyson that he had now read twice, and was on his way through a third time with the comfortable ease of someone revisiting familiar country. She put down the proofs and looked at the mountains. "I have been thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said, setting down the book. "There is a woman in Pueblo, I received a letter last week, whose father's homestead is being claimed by a mining company on the basis of a surface deed they say supersedes the original land entry. She has no legal representation and no survey experience and no resources. She is 25 years old and she is fighting it alone." Clayton was quiet for a moment. "Like you were." "Not entirely. She does not have my father's training. She does not know what to look for or where to find it." Maude paused. "I wrote back and told her what questions to ask and what documents to request. But it occurred to me that this is not the only such woman or man in this territory, and that the gap between having a grievance and having the specific technical knowledge to document it is the space where fraud lives." "What are you thinking?" he asked, with the attention of a man who recognizes that his wife's thinking tends to arrive fully formed and requires engagement rather than steering. "A practical guide," she said. "Published. Available. Written in plain language, not technical survey language, explaining in plain steps how to identify a fraudulent survey and how to begin building a documentation case. The kind of thing any homesteader can read and use." He looked at her. The last light of the Colorado evening was on her face, and she was completely herself, precise and fierce in planning, the woman who had sat in a corner for 2 hours gathering evidence before standing up and changing the room. "How long would it take to write?" he asked. 6 months, maybe 8 with the rest of what I have to do." "Then start it in the spring," he said. "After Alina is a bit older and Pete and Dan are settled into the full operation." She nodded, the quick, decisive nod of a woman who has had a decision confirmed and can now begin organizing the approach. "Clayton," she said. "Yes. Thank you." He looked at her with slight surprise. "For what?" "For always," she paused, choosing the exact words in her characteristic way. "For always expecting the next thing from me, not requiring less, expecting more, not from obligation but because you actually want to see it." He looked at her for a long moment in the last light of the October evening. "Maude," he said, "you are the most remarkable person I have ever known. I have been expecting more from you since the first 47 minutes, and I expect to continue doing so for the rest of my life. It is," he added, "probably my most reliable source of interest." She looked at him with the smile that she gave very rarely and meant entirely, the one that was not composed or professional or controlled, but simply and completely her. "That is a very good answer," she said. "I have had 5 years to prepare it," he said. She laughed, and he reached over and took her hand, and they sat together on the porch of the Townsend Crawford homestead in the Colorado October, while the mountains finished going dark, and the stars came out over the grassland, clear and brilliant and enormously indifferent and somehow, from exactly this particular vantage point, beautiful enough to make the whole long, difficult road that had arrived here feel not just worth it but necessary. Inside, Samuel was explaining something at considerable volume to his sister, and Alina was apparently responding in the calm, considering tone she had been born with. And from the kitchen, there was the smell of the bread that had been in since afternoon, and the horses were in the corral and the cattle in the east pasture, and the creek was running below the ridge in the dark, and the land, her father's land, her mother's land, her land was all around them, honest and permanent and known. The guide Maude wrote was finished in the spring of 1889. It was 42 pages. Clayton copy-edited it with the same precision he brought to survey field notes and made 17 suggestions, all of which she accepted after evaluating them on the merits. It was printed by a Denver publishing house in the summer of 1889 under the title, A Practical Guide to Identifying and Documenting Land Survey Fraud for Homesteaders and Property Owners, by Maude Townsend Crawford. The General Land Office ordered 300 copies for distribution to its regional offices. Marshal Theodore Goss, who had by this time prosecuted 2 additional land fraud cases using Maude's documented methodology, wrote her a personal letter to tell her that the guide had been read by his investigators and adopted into their standard intake checklist for disputed land claims. He also noted, in a postscript written in slightly smaller and more informal handwriting than the rest of the letter, that in 22 years he had never before recommended a document to both federal marshals and homesteaders simultaneously, but that this particular guide appeared to serve the same function from both ends of the problem. Maude read the letter and the postscript twice, and felt the particular satisfaction of work that has found its right use in the world. She pinned the postscript to the wall above her work desk, which was the corner of the main room that had always been hers, her father's transit and compass on the shelf above, her survey kit below, her ledgers arranged by year on the lower shelf, and now the Tennyson beside them, which she had acquired from Clayton's side of the bookcase, so gradually that neither of them had formally acknowledged when it had become hers. In the autumn of 1890, Samuel Crawford started school at the Caldwell Creek Schoolhouse, which was Clara Abbott's domain, and Clara reported back to Maude that he was the most opinionated 6-year-old she had encountered in 10 years of teaching, which he had clearly inherited from both parents, and that he was also reading 2 years above his level, which he had inherited specifically from Maude, and that he had organized 3 other children into a structured system for sharing food at lunchtime that was logistically more sophisticated than most adult arrangements she had seen, which she had no idea where he had gotten it. "Both of us," Clayton said, when Maude read him the letter. "Certainly," she said. Eleanor, 3 years old and conducting a comprehensive investigation of everything in the natural world within reach, was particularly attached to the survey compass, which she called the round thing, and which had to be kept on the upper shelf for reasons of safety, and because she had already demonstrated a sophisticated ability to operate the needle in ways that could not be described as entirely accidental. Maude taught her the directions one afternoon in October, sitting on the porch with the compass between them and the mountains as reference points. "North," she said, pointing. "North," Eleanor repeated with the gravity of a child receiving important information. "South," pointing in the opposite direction. "South, east, east, west, west." Eleanor looked up with her father's eyes and her mother's expression. "What is it for?" "It is for finding where you are," Maude said, "and for knowing exactly where the edges of things are so that no one can move them without you knowing." Eleanor considered this very seriously. "Good," she said, which was the correct answer. The homestead prospered through the 1890s with the quiet, compound prosperity of a place that has been built carefully and maintained consistently, the kind of accumulation that does not come from luck or single dramatic strokes, but from the sustained application of good judgment over time. The cattle operation became one of the stronger small ranches in the valley. The survey and consultation work continued. The 2 published papers became part of the standard reference material in Colorado territorial land law courses. George Pitts died in the spring of 1892 of a heart failure that the doctor said was sudden and without suffering, which was the frontier's gift to a man who had worked hard all his life and deserved a quick ending. Maude and Clayton were at his small ranch within the hour of hearing and helped his 2 sons with the arrangements, and the older son, a quiet, capable man named John Pitts, shook Clayton's hand and told Maude that his father had called her the most consequential person in the valley, and meant it as the highest compliment a man of his generation could give. Maude stood at George Pitt's grave in the Caldwell Creek Cemetery on a gray April day and thought about all the people who had stood up when it mattered and said the right things. George Pitts, who had given her a nod through the store window in October of 1883. Clayton, who had pushed his chair back 6 inches and asked about the bearing errors. Bart Alcott and his shaking hands and his 80 acres. All the ordinary courage of ordinary people presented with evidence of injustice and choosing, at some cost, to stand on the right side of it. She stood there with her hand in Clayton's and felt, as she sometimes did at moments like this, the weight and continuity of what had happened in Harlan's General Store 11 years ago. Not the drama of it. The drama had faded into history as drama always does, but the simple fact of it, which was that she had stood up and named a theft, and that act had ramified through 11 years of consequence, including the house behind her and the 2 children in the buggy and the man beside her, and the guide in 300 land offices, and the 4,000 acres of homesteaders' land that had been returned to its rightful owners. Her father had said that the land kept its own honest record. She had come to believe that people did as well if you were willing to read carefully enough. "Ready?" Clayton asked quietly. "Yes," she said. They walked back through the gray April morning to their children and their homestead and their life, which was full and honest and well-measured and entirely their own. Samuel Crawford became a surveyor, which surprised no one. He apprenticed with his father at 13 in the way of frontier education, which was still largely practical in its first decade, and by 16 could run a traverse survey with the same precision as Clayton, and had begun to show a particular talent for the legal interpretation of survey records that his mother had cultivated and refined over a lifetime. He was 19 in the spring of 1903, rangy and dark-haired and possessed of his father's stillness and his mother's precision, and the summer he turned 19. He passed the Colorado State Examination for licensed surveyors with the highest score recorded in 3 years. Clayton stood in the kitchen reading the examination results letter and looked at Maude across the table and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "His mother's mathematics. His father's field technique," she said. They were both right. Eleanor Crawford became a school teacher, which also surprised no one, and then a school superintendent, which surprised almost everyone, and then became the first woman on the Caldwell Creek Town Council in 1908, which surprised no one who had known her as a child. These things happened in the natural order of time, which is its own kind of justice, not the spectacular justice of a trial and a verdict, but the quieter, longer justice of a life built on solid ground, in which what you plant in honesty and maintain in care grows into the shape of what it was always supposed to become. In the autumn of 1903, 20 years after the October morning, when Maude Townsend had stood up from a corner chair in Harlan's General Store and named Elia's drum aloud in front of every man in the room, she and Clayton rode out to the western fence line of the Townsend Crawford homestead on a morning that was crisp and clear, and had the particular quality of light that Colorado reserved for late October. When the aspens had gone gold and the sky had deepened to its winter blue, and the mountains stood very clear and very close on the western horizon. They dismounted and stood at the fence, the original fence, her father's fence, the one that had been restored and repaired and was now so thoroughly and permanently in the right place that no one living in the valley would have thought to challenge it. The land stretched away from them to the west, familiar and unambiguous. 20 years, Clayton said. "Almost exactly," she said. He looked at the land and then at her. He was 52, gray at the temples now and deeply weathered by 2 decades of Colorado weather. And he had the ease of a man who has spent his middle life in a place that fits him and has become, gradually and entirely, at home in his own body and his own life. He was still the most immediately still person she had ever known. He was still, when she needed him to be, capable of occupying a piece of space with the particular physical certainty of a man who has nothing to prove. She was 47. Her dark hair had the gray thread at the temple and several friends now, which she regarded as an accurate representation of the facts. She was in full command of her professional reputation and her homestead and her family and her life, and she was, as she had been for 20 years, specifically and factually happy in the way she had decided to be and had built accordingly. He reached out and took her hand. "I want to tell you something," he said, which was what he had said at this fence line 20 years ago. "Tell me," she said, as she had then. "I am exactly where I want to be," he said. "I want you to know that, not in the way of a man who has made peace with a compromise, but in the way of a man who arrived at the right place and knew it and has never for a day mistaken it for anything else." She looked at him for a moment. All the careful, precise inventory she had kept for 20 years, every observation, every specific detail, every evidence of who he was present in that moment in its complete form, the full account. "So am I," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was not a gesture he made often and therefore meant completely what it said. The Colorado morning continued around them, large and honest and indifferent and beautiful, the aspens gold on the ridgeline and the creek running below, and the mountains standing in their ancient certainty to the west. The land kept its record. The people who had stood on it and worked it and fought for it and loved each other on it had kept theirs as well. Everything was, precisely and completely, as it should be.